being in the surf is a great picture for me of what Australia is. You meet all walks of life out there. Everyone can talk. Everyone's at the same level. You know, the ocean's a great leveler. It doesn't matter what you do, what you've achieved. That wave, that rogue set comes in, it just rolls you. It doesn't matter how brilliant you are at whatever else.
All right, guys, welcome back to the Aussie Ambitions podcast. I'm here with a guest, which I'm very appreciative of his time. We're going to learn about the world of architecture a little bit, and also just what life is like here in Australia with that profession, and maybe how we got there. So I just wanted to introduce our guest today. It's Nik Mitens. How are you doing, Nik?
Yeah, good. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So Nik is a director and owner of an architectural studio here on the Gold Coast, and we just had him in for a bit of a chat around things that are happening in his life, right now on Gold Coast. We're heading into 2021, and he actually works fairly close to where our studio is here. And I think the world of architecture is one of those areas where, on the theme of ambitions and what people are working on, I feel like people don't necessarily know exactly what goes on in that world. So I just wanted to introduce you, Nik, and maybe tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Nice.
We were just talking about before how it was an interesting thing. You got in contact with us, and the title of the podcast was Aussie Ambitions, and that in itself means so many different things to me. I had an ambition to become an Aussie at one point. I was actually born in Denmark, but I've lived in many places around the world. I came here from about 11 years living in London. And it was an ambition of mine for a very long time to become an Aussie. This is the third time that I live here. I lived here back in 2000. Then later on, when I finished uni, I went back, lived in Sydney for a couple of years, had to leave because of all the visa rules, etc. Ended up in London, but for 11 years had the ambition of becoming an Aussie, and I managed to finally go through with that in 2015 and return and become part of the HHH Architects here on the Gold Coast.
Oh, wow. All right. Well, that's actually an extra level of, I guess, incorporating into how you ended up here. Obviously, I can volunteer as well that I did move outside the country into Australia about 10, 12 years ago now. And I agree. I think that's something that a lot of people would be curious about. So if you're listening at home and you're interested about how people that have been born and raised outside the country come to establish in Australia, I would say it's not that easy. It's not just wide open borders. I don't know. What was your experience?
Yeah, no, it's certainly not easy. Depending on, I suppose, your level of qualification, your type of job, there are different ways in. As I said, this is my third time living here. This one's forever, I think. That's certainly the ambition. But depending on the stage of your life, there's a multitude of ways in. For me, the first time I think I was here on a working holiday visa, and did the travelling around, the backpacking, and I actually hitchhiked around Australia with a surfboard. Not the easiest thing to do, but you get little rides at a time. The second time I came back as a graduate and managed to kind of work my way through various companies in Sydney, but the visa didn't have the staying power, if you want to call it that, and I ended up having to leave, and then I've come back as a permanent resident. So there's many ways of coming to Australia. There's certainly many ways to stay. We recently sponsored a chap from Colombia and his partner to stay here and get permanent residency.
Wow. That's I like the way we started on this, and I think this obviously hopefully people can learn from it and just maybe understand what it's like, and maybe why people, obviously it's a nice country to live in, and there's a whole way of life here, and even that's a whole other conversation. But the idea of getting the visas and things like that. So when you said the time was up, is it just because you were allotted a certain amount of time, and did someone come after you, or it's just self-managed?
Let's call it self-managed. No, my time on the visa was up. I actually ended up getting sponsored by my employer in Sydney at the time, but there was a girl 17,000 kilometres away, and I made some decisions that you do when you're a young man, and went for that instead of I suppose a different ambition than a professional one. That didn't work out, and I ended up in London. And once I was there, I always kept meeting Aussies, and I always said to myself, look, ultimately, that's where I'm going to end up. I mean, try living in London when you're a surfer. It's 4 hours at best in a car to get to any kind of decent waves, and I'd do that pretty much every weekend when I was there. I always had the thought, like, no, at some point, got to get back to Australia.
Wow. And so is surfing something that you do on the daily now, or where does that fit?
I have 2 kids. I have 2 boys, and they get to surf. I don't get to surf that often now. That's okay. Yeah. I'm sure I'll get back to it. Yeah. One of my business partners is kind of early 60s, and he's at a time of his life where he can surf whatever he wants, and that's probably what'll happen.
Okay, so it's definitely a time allotment thing. You've got
but surfing is something I think for some people they need to do it every day, and like I said, it's like a drug. They need to get on that board every day. To me, it's just as much. It's a place where I go and I empty out my brain. I go in the water, I just forget everything else, and I think it's a great, like, being in the surf is a great picture for me of what Australia is. You meet all walks of life out there. Everyone can talk. Everyone's at the same level. The ocean's a great leveler. It doesn't matter what you do, what you've achieved. That wave, that rogue set comes in, it just rolls you. It doesn't matter how brilliant you are at whatever else. So it's a great leveler. And I actually think it's a good picture of what Australia is, to me, at least. It's quite an egalitarian place. It affords people opportunities, but it's also a place where, coming from London, you would never see, I'm just going to pick two types of people. You'd never see a plumber and a solicitor out for lunch together. Okay. If you saw them together, you'd have no doubt who was who. And even if they open their mouth, they hardly speak the same language. In Australia, you wouldn't pick it. 2 guys in boardies walking down the beach, you don't know who's who. And I find that amazing. I love that.
I wonder, just as an open question to the people listening and perhaps watching, is interesting to see the awareness of that kind of thing. I think there's a certain stereotype of Aussie life and an Aussie bloke or Sheila or however you want to call it out, and the wildlife and all that. But this is really what we wanted to do, is just get some real context. And of course, people come here and visit because it is a great country to visit and live in. But do you think that's a cultural thing? Is that coming from some structure that? Whether it's a government or a historical thing?
I love speculating, and I love kind of making up my own stories about why things are the way they are. I think to some degree that there was a monoculture here that was founded around really hard work and very tough living conditions. So if you didn't stick together, if you didn't help each other, if you weren't friends, if you couldn't say hello to each other, then you just wouldn't hack it. And I still think, it's still there. Like, even when I lived in Sydney for a couple of years, you'd get on a busy bus in rush hour in the morning to go to work, and the girl sitting next to you opens her purse and she goes, "Oh, do you want gum?" Like, that doesn't happen in London. No one goes out of their way to talk to each other. Like, I'll go for a walk in the morning or whatever. I'll say hello to everyone. Everyone says hello back. No one looks down. No one looks away. People engage, and I think a lot of Aussies take pride in that sense of community. And I think the Gold Coast is a great place for that. It's a very kind of family-oriented place to live, where a lot of people are here to kind of strike a balance between family life, lifestyle, if you want to call it, pursuits of outdoor living, and outdoor pursuits like surfing, for example, and their work. And a lot of people move here, start businesses to find that balance. So, they can work and do the things that they love to do. But there's a lot of Aussies, like, you'll go for a barbecue and you ask someone, "So what do you do?" And they go, "I love spearfishing." He didn't answer, "What is what is my profession? You know, he didn't say I'm a dentist or I'm a bricklayer. He told you what he loves doing. And I think that's a great thing about Australia. And, you know, the Gold Coast is a regional city, but it's got a real international flavour, like, you know, far beyond its size, I think, really. Because people come here from all over because it's got a, you know, the beaches, etc. It's got a unique draw. And, you know, sitting here with a Canadian, a Danish person, not sure where Dylan's from. An Aussie, there you go. So it's about right, 2-1.
Yeah.
And I love that in Australia. But I think what Australia does offer is a place where people can come and they can fit in. I don't feel like I need to always explain my backstory, where I'm from. I wasn't born here, but I can be an Aussie, just like anyone else can be an Aussie. And I'm accepted as that.
That's I actually wouldn't. It's interesting to see how to follow where someone's from or their origins. Like I wouldn't have necessarily known that you were born overseas and you had migrated. There's a level of, I guess, the language and the culture. Do you feel like do you identify as an Australian having settled here?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. And then I almost feel like the stories you're sharing are in contrast to some other locations. So if someone was born and raised here, they may not know the context of London or the context of America and so on. Yeah. Do you think that works for you or against you?
I think you can make it work for you. Whether it sets you apart, maybe. I think most people have experienced the feeling of travelling, whether they go somewhere and settle or whether they're just travelling. But I think you'll recognise that feeling of travelling, and you feel slightly special when you're travelling because you're there, you're viewing that place from a slightly different platform, you're travelling through, you're away from your origins, or, you know, even when you're travelling, you're away from your everyday life, so you can kind of reinvent yourself a little bit. But, you know, I've lived in 4 different continents, and I think every time you go somewhere, you get an opportunity to kind of slightly reinvent yourself, keep the good things, but leave other things behind. And, you know, I can be Aussie Nik here, and it's probably slightly different to who I was when I lived in London, for example, or when I lived in Istanbul, or when I lived in Africa, or where I was from in Denmark. You know, you're allowed maybe to live in a different way, to express yourself in a different way. You know, certainly, London's an interesting place because it's also very multicultural and melting pot, just like Australia as a country is. But I remember after about 8 or 9 years in London, I realised something that I've been thinking a lot about and I've been pondering. I realised that in my workplace, there was about 70 of us. There were sort of groups of friends and groups of people that would hang out and do stuff outside of work. And it took me about 8 or 9 years to realise that all my friends at work were all foreigners. And the British people had their own group. And it was hard to penetrate. The Brits are not, you know, there's an island nation. They're not quite like the other Europeans. I would hang out with the Spanish people, the South Americans, the Italians. Australia isn't really like that to me. It's very much open, and it levels you all the time.
I think that's a good reminder. We spoke about that earlier about the leveling and the, I guess on the theme of ambitions, we've brought that up a few times, and it's nice to hear that there's a natural connection, I think, with a lot of the other guests that are coming through. So the ambition isn't necessarily a career level. I mean, career gets often mixed with ambition and, you know, what are you aspiring to and so on. But the happiness being the end goal, or the maybe the next skill that you're going to learn being I aspire to that, and all this kind of stuff. I think I
suppose one of those, I don't know if it's a fake meme or whatever, but, you know, one of those things that you come across on social media from time to time is the story of John Lennon, who did an essay, I think, in school, and they're asked to, you know, to basically detail what's your ambition in life, and how I know the story goes. John Lennon wrote to his teacher, you know, I want to be happy, and that was it, full stop. And the teacher said, I think you've misunderstood the question. And later on, John Lennon then said, well, I actually think now that he'd misunderstood life.
Interesting. Hey?
I don't know if John Lennon ever did that, but, you know,
exactly.
You know, people like to associate famous people with something they've thought up rather than say it themselves because they think, you know, they'll be listened to more. But I quite like that story. You know, it's not really look. don't get me wrong, I'm a hugely ambitious person in terms of my professional life. I think as an architect, you've got an opportunity to, to kind of influence the world and the cities that you're in, and to a degree that not many other professions can. And I'm ambitious about that because I'm passionate about it. But to me, I'm equally ambitious about being able to spend time with my two boys, with my wife, and with my friends and family, and to do other things that make me happy and make me a balanced person. And Australia's certainly great for that. I think there's a kind of there's an inbuilt understanding here that those things are also important.
That's really helpful to hear for people that are curious about just the fabric of society and the mix of things. I think I can definitely support that. I feel like the balance, I guess the origins of this podcast is really to highlight that the way of life here does generally celebrate balance, and it's not, people would actually look down on you if you worked a super, super long day without any balance, even though in some of the major cities it tends to get that international influence, the New York style and the London style, and Canada's got Toronto, and you earn your stripes by putting in the long hours and so on. But here, it would almost be looked at as perhaps an antisocial thing. I don't know if you've seen that in your industry.
2 weeks of holiday a year in America. I don't see many Aussies lasting the long run.
And let's spell that out for people. So that's what I grew up with, is 2 weeks of annual leave, they'd call it, like basically time off. Yeah. 2 weeks a year. And then here, the minimum is 4 weeks, if I got that right. Yeah. And then if you're...
But most workplaces, our workplaces are certainly like that. We'll just listen to the individual. So if you want more holidays, we can make that work. And I think, not just in Australia, I suppose that's worldwide phenomenon now. Most employers are becoming more and more alert to the fact that people have other ambitions than just being there, and those ambitions may not necessarily be professional. There could be many other things, and they want to be able to find that time to do those things. I don't see why people should sit on their bum from 9 to 5 every day and 5 days a week.
Yep.
And then go on 4 weeks of holiday, and there's so many other ways to do it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people mix their their life up a bit more and do more holidays. We certainly promote flexible working in our workplace, and I think people just are much happier, stick around for a lot longer if they know that we value their life and their happiness and their families more than just the output they can give us.
I think that's very healthy thinking, and it'd be interesting to see how others, view that. Obviously, there's just a world of transformation out there, and there's sort of the gig economy, and having a full-time job is sort of, not so sure these days.
Look, I get that some people are able to use let's call it the gig economy to kind of shape their lives and do other things, and to work whenever they want. But I think there's also a bad side of that gig economy, which is that it's actually forced upon a large portion of a generation that's coming into their working life now by people that maybe aren't great employers. And it's not just private enterprise. State government do it as well. I find it quite odd sometimes that you're, as an employer, you're scrutinised in how you deal with your employees, like all the way down to what you're allowed to talk to them about. Whereas, for me, I just try and be a good person, as much as I can. And so I go, why can't I ask these questions? Why can't I engage on these subjects? Why can't I? Because all I'm trying to do is get a basis for me to understand my employees so that I know how I can get them to be as happy as I can so that they will produce great work. But quite often you're not allowed to ask questions, you're not allowed to engage with their private life. And then at the same time you see state government keeping people in gig economy contract work for a decade before they offer them a permanent position. I find that strange.
That's helpful.
Anyway, I'm not going to politicise here.
No, but it's painting the pictures for people that would not necessarily know that Australia has a certain framework and that they're quite clear on what the employee rights are and how, protection, and there's lots of different. And one actually overall question I had about just how much change you may have seen in the country and what direction we're headed in. But let's just say I'll offer up my observation that things change fairly quickly in things like city development. I see buildings go up and regulation doesn't seem to be too held up. But when it comes to government and change, actually I should say the government leaders have changed quite often in the last 10 years as well. Yeah. So I do feel like it's a lot more dynamic than the previous country where I was living in Canada. What are your thoughts on changes? Do you see a lot of changes that affect society, like rule changes, for example?
I sometimes think maybe there's perhaps a tendency to change things just to change them. I don't know if it's partly to do with having a kind of a mainly two-party political scene where it's almost, if you've been shouting loud about how the other party is doing it when they're in power, then when you come in, you almost have to change things. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think, in actual fact, when people get together, no matter what spectre of policy they're in, they probably agree on 95 or 90% of things. It's just, they've got the same objectives. They've just maybe got different things or different ways of getting there. And I sometimes think, look, changing things just for the sake of them politically, I'm not sure it helps anyone. Certainly in the world of architecture and development and, compliance, red tape, legislation, building regulations, you can keep changing things. I'm not always sure it really makes things better. But it's interesting, a lot of people talk about, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but, in terms of architecture, people go, look at buildings in the old days. They were much better. They were more like this or more like that. Look at that, when you go to Rome or when you go to Berlin, look at the way they're built, look at the style of them. And I go, you are aware that architecture it's not a free art like painting or sculpture or something like that. It is, whilst it may be considered an art form and there's an artistic side to it, it's very bound up in regulations and, fire regulations, escape distances, combustibility of materials and, availability of materials and everything. And actually when you go back and look historically of different styles and different ways of building cities or buildings, you'll find that there's a reason why they were coherent at a certain time, because those are the materials available. Those were the fire regulations. Those, were the economic drivers, and those were the trends. So it's not like they just had a unique, better style at the time. It was just, Georgian architecture was all about, small openings because everything was built out of brick. And then you get to the next style, it's like, it's slightly different because you brought in a new way of building something, and there was a big fire, so now suddenly you had to have 2 stairs or whatever. And so it changed the way buildings were built. And I think it's really, it's interesting now because things change very quickly, and maybe that's one of the reasons why people think that cities nowadays are a bit of a mishmash, because you don't get a long period of an established style. Things change really quickly.
That's really brings back to light the fact that on the Gold Coast here, it's sort of it's a different real estate market than say some of the bigger cities, and it's less history, let's say. Yes. I see some photos from, maybe we can share some of those after, but even maybe 30 years ago or 50 years ago, we're talking about serious transformation.
Yeah. I was just on a Facebook page the other day, actually. It's called something like, have you seen the old Gold Coast? I'll promote it shamelessly. There's thousands of pictures up there, all are uploaded by users of the group. And they are historic photos. But, having moved here from London, where you think of historic photos or historic maps, you think about medieval times and, a drawing of a man of a horse on Hampstead Heath, and you see a manor house in the background going, that's Kenwood House. Yeah, that was there in 1280 or whatever. Here, just going on a Facebook page and just seeing there was a picture of Nobby Beach, where I live, and it wasn't 50 years old, that picture, and there was just no buildings. And so you get that very condensed timeline from bush to big city. And it's such an interesting thing with the Gold Coast that it's got that condensed timeline. So everyone who's lived here for any amount of time will have seen a huge amount of change. I mean, I left the city for 20 years and came back. And in fact, I wouldn't say it was a city when I left, it was a town. But it had changed a great deal in 20 years. And 20 years from now, it'll have changed a great deal again. Such an interesting place.
Well, that's the interesting bit, is having to live here and talk to people who've lived here. Like, what is it like to just remember those times where there's just transformation? I mean, even the addition of a tram, like the public transit, that's sort of a city transformation, to get public transit straight through.
Yeah.
Now, not that many people use it still, so that's the interesting bit.
They've got a lot more uptake than what they thought they were going to have in their feasibility studies. It's been a roaring success in that sense.
I think, I mean, I love it, but I find it interesting.
It's hard to get anywhere other than along that spine, but one day will come where they'll get more spurs on it.
So just for the people that are understanding the difference between maybe city planner and architect, is there any overlap? Architect, can you just define that for us?
Yeah, I suppose there's varying types of architects. Actually, when I studied for about 6 years. The first half of it was a general kind of architectural studies, and the latter part for me was specialising in what we named urban transformation. So it was a mixture of maybe getting historic buildings, or don't have to be old buildings, but any building which its lifetime was up, or its use was no longer there, and you had to transform the building, restore the building, renovate the building, or convert it into something new, and then all the way scaling up to whole parts of cities that were undergoing major change. I'll take an example in Melbourne, the Docklands in Melbourne, or any North American city will have, docklands or rail yards or whatever that are no longer in use and that have been reinvented as condos or recreational spaces or whatever, old semi-industrial areas that are no longer needed, that were to change. And that's sort of that was for a long time my focus in architecture, was how building buildings is like, what bricks are in buildings are in cities. And I'm very interested in cities and how they work, how people behave in cities, how people reinvent themselves when they get to a city. And a lot of young people might move from the countryside where their parents thought it would be a great place to bring them up, safe environment. They get to a certain age and they go, I have ambitions, so I'm now going to move, I'm going to study. They suddenly live in a city and they find themselves going, wow, this is different. But yeah, the Gold Coast is a very kind of condensed city like that. It's got a very short timeline, and it's constantly reinventing itself. I heard someone say recently, thought it was quite interesting, he says, there's a tendency on the Gold Coast to kind of get here, you fall in love with it, and so you move here, from whether it be from Melbourne or from Vancouver or from Beijing, you fall in love with what it is, and then you live here for a while and a lot of people start going, I liked it better how it was. And so, but then other people are just arriving 10 years or 20 years later and going, I love it now, I'm falling in love with this is what I like. And people go, no, it was much better 20 years ago. And so it's this thing of, your virgin when you've just moved here is someone else's old hag because they've been here for a long time. And I, like, being an architect, I'm kind of a different opinion on that. I think the city's just getting better and better. It's changing, but it's getting better and better. And I know there was a famous German architect from a long time ago said, if you're an architect, you have to believe that tomorrow is better than yesterday. Otherwise, find something else to do.
Ooh, okay, this is good stuff.
But
now,
as an architect, you instigate change. Like, you can't get around that. That's what you do. You change a place.
I think that's really where some of these little nuggets are quite powerful, because unless you've lived it, you don't really get exposure to it. So I think that's the benefit of experience over the years. Is that, did you have some mentor that parlayed all this knowledge to you, or how did you
not
get
really
to where you were?
Not really. I mean, I suppose when you study architecture, you end up looking up to certain architects maybe that you'll never get to meet, but you see their body of work and you read about them, and you grasp onto certain parts of that and go, that's what I'd like to do. But then I think as well, not just in architecture, but in most professions, you probably, as you build yourself and you build your skills and your knowledge, you meet certain people along the way that might be from a different generation, and you kind of, you get a certain understanding from them and you learn from them, and, I think that's certainly the case with architects. I remember my professor in architecture school used to say, I am an architect, but I don't build buildings, I build other architects. And, that was his thing in life. He built architects. He was very good at it. I don't think he ever built a building, but yeah.
And would he have had a touch point to reach people at a moment in their early career where they were deciding, like, where does that seed of knowledge hit someone that's going to take that up? Is it like high school or early days? Or
for
after?
me, I seem to remember deciding I want to be an architect at a very young age. I think it was either that or a writer or historian. I quite liked history. I still do like history. I think at one point I decided that, look, you can write. I like poetry and things, and I figured out that, well, you can write that, inspired by your life. Doesn't necessarily require you having studied, English literature or something like that for 5 years in university, at least from my perspective. And history is something that you can be interested in and you can pursue, and you can learn about, again, on the side, whereas architecture's maybe, unless you're just interested in looking at it, but if you want to actually do it, it does require quite a level of commitment and quite a level of training. It's not an easy profession. And I actually, going back, I actually looked at it and went, I wasn't a genius or anything, but I did fairly well at school. I was, academic. I did fairly well with not a lot of effort. Got, pretty top grades. But I found that there were certain things I found hard. And when I first started drifting towards architecture, I found, that's actually really, really hard. And that was what drew me into it, just how hard it was. And I remember getting to architecture school and kind of, I think about a week in, I went, wow, I really had no idea what this was or what I was getting into. But that intrigued me. And I really, the first 3 years in architecture school, I really didn't do very well. Like, I nearly flunked and had to do the first part again. But I somehow scraped through, I think maybe on attitude through this interview where they were going to determine whether I was going to fail and do it all again. But I don't know, there was a turning point around that time. I got the opportunity through my professor, who was Turkish, to go and live in Istanbul for a while and do a project for UNESCO World Heritage in an old part of Istanbul called Galata. And I think that for me was a turning point. So that thing of leaving the comfort zone of my university, my studies, my everyday, and going somewhere so radically different, and kind of had to fend for myself. And suddenly I found a different way of thinking about what it is an architect does, because it was very much a kind of hearts and minds kind of project where it was a very, very historic part of, the multi-layered part of Istanbul, all the way back from, kind of Greek settlement to Roman times to medieval architecture. But the people that lived there didn't really care much for it. It was just an old part of town where, you could just do whatever you wanted. But trying to get them to understand that actually they're living in a gold mine was such an eye-opener. And I think that sort of focused me. And once I found my focus, I dare say I became pretty good at it. But it is something, architecture is something that takes a very long time to get good at. Most of the really great architects are, in their 60s, 70s, 80s maybe. So I've got a way to go.
It's definitely great to get you to just share it firsthand. Again, it's one of those things, like, how many architects would somebody know in their life? If you just think of people across the globe, different countries, I would say it's a pretty small percentage. I mean, it's sort of, there's a professional circle of, doctor, lawyer, architect's definitely a title that's out there. I've just, in your thoughts, is it I've got sort of some bullet points listed. Is it creative, scientific, engineering, innovation? Is there some field?
All of the above.
Okay.
All of the above. It's really, and that's what keeps me at it. It's different every day. I think the main defining characteristic of architecture for me, at least when you work in a practice or a studio where you do project work. I mean, I guess some architects might work in a council where they're more organisational, maybe. But for me, doing architectural projects, that's the defining thing. I do project work. And whether I'm an architect or an engineer or something else, I do project work, and my life is about the project, and the project is a very kind of slow burning thing. You know, it's a long process. Other people come into work and they fulfill a role at their work, and they do that, and they do that every day, and it's more or less the same, and they're comfortable with that. I would wither up and die. I couldn't do it. For me, project work is an amazing thing, and I often say this. I look at my phone, and I'm trying to find a photo of something, and I flick through, and I see, the collages of all the photos on the iPhone. They're kind of changing. Oh, that was the time when I was doing that shopping centre. That was the time when I was doing that high rise. That was the time when I was doing that house renovation. And in between all these photos of buildings are photos of my kids growing up, and I realised that my eldest is like 2 years old there, and that's the first picture of that house or that building. Here's the picture of where that house is ending, and my kid's now on his bike, cycling. These projects take a big chunk of your life. I've worked on projects that have been going for 10 years. So you kind of, that's the big difference for me from architecture to other professions. So if you're a dentist, your longest project's probably, putting braces on a teenager and tending to them for 9 months or whatever. I know you have clients that you might see for 20 years, but architecture is different like that.
It's a very, very, very unique look. I mean, it's a mix of your own personal experience, maybe perhaps a little bit of the Australian flavor of how things are done here, but ultimately, hopefully people can take inspiration from early days about maybe they're considering that career path, or maybe it's just an appreciation of the profession. And just throwing it out there, again, I mentioned that architect, I perceive it to be one of those titles that gets a lot of credibility on, can you go to the bank and just get a loan, snap your fingers, or is it...
I don't know about the bank.
Is it prestige?
I remember one time being at a party, this was my younger days, I remember being at a party and a girl asked me, so what do you do? And I said, I'm an architect. She misheard me. She was very interested. She kept asking me questions. I didn't quite get the questions, but she was clearly very interested in me. And then later on I realised she thought I'd said I was an actor. So there are things that are perceived to be above architects, I guess. But yeah, I get that. Like the perception of what an architect does or who an architect is, I think is something that most people have an idea, but I actually think being an architect and what you do as an architect is quite different from what most people perceive you to be doing. We talk about Hollywood stereotypes, etc., and there's not many great male, for some reason, always male actors that haven't at one point portrayed the architect. And I think they always find that in a movie, if you've got to have, it's a rom-com or something like that. You pick Jude Law or something like that, and he's got to be professional. He's got to have style because he's got to appeal to people, and he's got to be approachable and also lovable, and he's got to be a good person. Architect, that's the one. He's going to be an architect, this guy. And I don't know whether there's a certain love for architecture in the in the filmmaking world or something, but so many of them. What's the one with is it Paul Newman or Robert Redford? I forget. The Towering Inferno, where the architect saves the day.
Oh, he's the hero?
Yeah, and it's like a 70s disaster movie. And the tower goes up in flames, and the architect is essentially the guy who saves the day. I remember watching it. We did in architecture school. I did a course in high-rise building, which now has come to help me living on the Gold Coast, where we have high rises. But I remember this scene where the architect, he's in the basement or something. He's trying to stop this electrical fire, and he runs into the basement. He opens up this electrical cabinet, and he looks at it and he goes, "These are not the wires that we specify the engineer to use. This is why there's a problem with the fire, and this is why it's spreading so fast." And all architecture students in this theatre, we were laughing. That's not what an architect does. An architect has no idea about that. We just do some big, like, there was first year architecture school, I think. We do big lines, we're artists, we kind of live life. Unfortunately, no, the architect does have to know everything. Not everything about everything, but we have to know a little bit about everything. So, you do have to know a little bit about wiring. You do have to know a little bit about, bollards and traffic calming, and a little bit about glazing, and a little bit about energy efficiency, and a little bit about everything. And you can't just ignore it, because it's got to get built. If you don't know anything about it, you can't build it. So it's quite an all-encompassing role. And I don't know whether that is, kind of gregarious thing is what the Hollywood set like, and why they like portraying architects.
If it works for you, I guess take it and until the world changes. But it's I think it's been super helpful to really get a little bit of a deep dive. And I guess if people have more questions, they can just pursue some of the things that maybe Nik touched on today, and seek it out for yourself. What's maybe relevant in your country, but some of the trends are. I feel like obviously there's an element of creativity, which I appreciate. And then also an element of making your mark. I mean, obviously, these are long-lasting projects that will live on, and that will become the new history. Right? What you're doing now will hopefully be up for.
You can't run it once it's built. You can't really run away from it. It's there.
Yeah, and that's and there's an element of contributing and just making a mark. So I think that's it's fantastic to be involved in that. So thanks very much for sharing that story, Nik.
No, thank you.
Appreciate it. And guys, if you want to check back, we'll hopefully keep up with what Nik's up to, and over the years we welcome him back anytime. So thanks,
Nick.
All right, all the best.
Cheers.